The Day 10 self-assessment ensures you understand how the while loop works. You've already seen the definite for loop, where you can execute a series of Python statements a fixed number of times. But what if you don't know in advance how many times you want to exercise a sequence of statements? Then you turn to the while statement, which is common in many programming languages. So the assessment for Day 10 is to have the user enter in one number at a time until the user enters the same number twice. And then I'll print out all the values that were entered. So this will have a little ambiguity. We'll try to deal with that as we can. So to write this program, I'm going to have to define a new function, and this will be called enter unique, because I'm going to interpret this to say until the user enters the same number twice, which means that they've entered a number in that they've already entered in before. To work with this, let's add some documentation. You've seen it now, the ability to document functions. Let's do that now. Allow user to input numbers one at a time until they have entered in the number already seen. So with this, I now have a smaller documentation. And the reason why that's so useful is that if you ever find yourself looking at some Python code and you see a function and you want to know, well, what does it require? Well, here, as soon as you start typing, you're going to call that function. It gives you the documentation string, which is the string that I just entered in right there. It's a very useful thing, and from now on out, in every function we write, we will make sure we have this documentation string. This function is going to retrieve input and then print them out. So at the very end of this function, I'm going to say print values. Note this function is not asking to return the values, it's just printing out the full list of values that were entered in. I'll start with values being an empty list, and then at some point I need to do a sequence of statements. Now we know how to input numbers using the input command, and this will of course enter in a number, and I will add it using the append statement. Now this will work, but of course this just enters in one number and then prints it out. Enter in 3883, that's all I have. What I want to do is I want to enter in a sequence of numbers one at a time until the user enters the same number twice. Now since I don't know in advance how many times this is going to execute, then I will do the following. I will say, well, as long as it is a true statement, this is the guard to the while loop. This is a common structure in computer science. This is right now an infinite loop. This will run forever. And that's of course not what you want. But what I get to do is use the break statement that you've already seen. And now when the program believes that it's time to stop the loop, it will do so. And so the way that I will capture that is here with an if statement. If user enters a number already in the list, then stop and quit the loop. Now what the break statement needs is an if statement to tell under what circumstances this works. So how do I know if the user has entered a number that was already seen? Well, I know that values contains the list of numbers that I'm adding one at a time to. And so if it ever turns out that the number that they've typed in is in fact in my values, then I know I've seen it before. So I say break. Now what this lets you do, I can enter numbers, and it's going to keep on going until I see a number that I've already seen before. And you'll notice something very important. When did it break the while loop? The while loop contains three statements: inputting a num from the keyboard, checking to see if numbers and values, and then appending it. I have to make sure that I do my break before I go to the append. Otherwise, I will have that number in twice. And that's not what it looks like the specification requests. So this is the standard solution for this assessment. If, however, you had read this to mean until the user enters the same number twice in a row, I'll just make a little note of that, in a row, then you have to change the if statement. So if I'm going to do it twice in a row, I'll just make that change. Same number twice in a row. And I know that I can do this because the number that is the last number seen, well, that's going to be the very last value in the list. And we know how to get the very last value in a list. You've seen the ability to take a list and retrieve any of its values one at a time. Now the trick is going to be, well, what happens if I have a list and the list is empty? So the values of the zeroth, I'm going to get this list index out of range. So I have to be careful about this. And so now to make this one the final solution for this slightly harder question, you will say, well, if it turns out that values is in fact empty, and I know that values is empty, if you ask what's the length of values, if that's 0, then I know there's nothing I need to do because I couldn't have entered in a number before. So what I want to do is only do this check if the length of values is not 0, or you might even just say greater than 0. That's easier to understand. If the length of values is greater than 0, then I have to check. And the check would look like the following. And number is greater than, no, and number is equal to the last value in the list, which is values -1. If that is ever the case, then I break. Let's see what this looks like. You'll see that I made a slightly more detailed discussion. This enter unique allows the user to enter in numbers one at a time until they've entered the same number in twice in a row. So 1, 2, 1, 2. There's a keep on alternating, but as soon as I do 2 in a row, it stops. So whether you interpreted this to be break if you enter in a number you've seen at some point, or if it's a number twice in a row, you now have seen the solution. This one is a little more complicated, and I want you to kind of review this and see if you fully understand what's going on here. This makes sure that you know you at least have at least one number in the list, otherwise there's no point in doing the check. And the check here says, was the number entered the very last one that you've seen? And I know it's the last one because I'm appending them to the right. So you've actually done 2 assessments for the price of 1, and this completes the assessment.